a black executive, fresh from closing the biggest deal of his career, arrived at the airport with nothing but relief and the anticipation of going home. But as he approached the first-class lounge, a security officer, blinded by prejudice, stepped in his way, questioning him with an edge that felt too familiar. Despite holding the right credentials, he was humiliated in front of a room full of travelers. 7 minutes later, after one phone call, that same officer was escorted out of the airport. Jobless. What followed stunned everyone present and ignited a ripple effect that no one could have predicted. Stay with me. This is a story that demands to be heard. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more narratives that shine a light on moments of quiet resistance and justice. It started as just another business trip. The airport was alive with the quiet hum of motion, the kind of restless energy that builds in places where people are forced to wait. Nathan Clark felt it pressing against him as he stood by the departure gate, his fingers absently tracing the worn leather handle of his briefcase. Beside him, Evelyn shifted her weight, adjusting the soft blue scarf draped around her shoulders. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Nathan could read the air as well as she could. The subtle glance from the flight attendant at the counter. The pause, just long enough to register surprise. It wasn't overt. No one called attention to it. But it was there, flickering behind the tight, professional smile that followed. First class is boarding now. The attendant called, her eyes drifting over them as if by habit. She seemed unsure for a moment, as if waiting for someone to explain their presence in the line. Nathan stepped forward, offering their boarding passes with the ease of someone accustomed to these moments. The attendant took the passes, barely glancing at him, but when her eyes settled on Evelyn's name, something shifted. Walker, she said aloud, and then, almost to herself, I didn't realize, quote. Nathan arched a brow, waiting. The attendant caught herself, quickly pressing the tickets against the scanner. You're all set, she said, her tone sliding back into routine. Enjoy your flight. Nathan held Evelyn's gaze as they walked down the jet bridge. She offered a small, knowing smile but said nothing. Because this wasn't new. It wasn't the first time their presence in a space had been questioned. Not by words, but by the long shadows cast by assumption. They had grown used to it. But familiarity doesn't soften the edges. It simply teaches you how to carry the weight differently. Inside the cabin, the first-class section greeted them with the cool hush of privilege. Rows of empty leather seats stretched out before them, each one wide and inviting. A few passengers were already seated, newspapers folded neatly on their laps, briefcases tucked beneath their feet. Nathan settled in by the window, exhaling softly as he watched the ground crew move about below. Evelyn eased into the seat beside him, crossing her legs with the kind of poise that belonged to someone who had long learned to command attention without raising her voice. A flight attendant, a different one now, younger, approached with 2 glasses of champagne. Her smile warm but careful. Welcome aboard, she said, setting the glasses down with practiced precision. Nathan nodded his thanks, watching her as she moved on. For a moment, there was peace. But the first crack always comes quietly. It was the woman in the next row. Nathan caught the flicker of her gaze from the corner of his eye. She glanced at Evelyn, then at him, and then at their seats. Her lips pressed together, not in anger, but in quiet confusion, the kind born from an unspoken equation that didn't quite add up. Nathan could almost hear the thought forming. I didn't expect them to be here. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze with a polite nod. She hesitated, offering a thin smile in return before returning to her book. But Nathan knew better. She wasn't reading. The thing about prejudice, Nathan thought, is that it rarely announces itself. It simply lingers, patient and unassuming, waiting to be noticed. Evelyn reached over, resting her hand lightly on his knee. Let it be, she whispered, her voice just for him. He smiled, leaning back into his seat. I already have. But as the engines roared to life, Nathan wondered just how long that peace would last. The plane ascended smoothly, cutting through the dense January sky. The cabin lights dimmed, softening the edges of the world outside. For a brief moment, Nathan Clark allowed himself to believe in the quiet. The hum of the engines. The rhythmic clinking of glasses. The soft shuffle of flight attendants tending to passengers. But peace, Nathan knew, was fragile. The first ripple came as the dinner service began. Karen, the senior flight attendant, moved through the first-class cabin with a briskness that suggested she had done this 1,000 times. Her smile appeared and disappeared with mechanical precision, each interaction punctuated by pleasantries that felt well-worn but sincere enough to pass. Until she reached Nathan and Evelyn. "Good evening," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "Chicken or pasta?" Nathan caught the flicker in her eyes. The hesitation. It wasn't much, but it was there, tucked behind the mask of professionalism she wore. "We'll have the pasta," Evelyn answered, her tone light but measured. Karen nodded, placing the trays down with the careful indifference reserved for strangers she did not expect to see again. But as she turned to leave, Nathan caught the briefest glance she exchanged with the attendant following behind her. A glance that lingered just a breath too long. It was small, so small it could have been dismissed entirely. But Nathan had spent his life collecting small things. Evelyn must have seen it too. Because as Karen moved down the aisle, Evelyn lifted her glass of water slowly, holding it just beneath her lips. "She's curious," Evelyn said softly, without turning her head. Nathan smiled faintly. "Curiosity can be harmless." "Maybe," Evelyn replied, setting the glass down gently, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "But not always." The clinking of silverware filled the silence between them. But the mood had shifted. Nathan could feel it, like a ripple spreading outward. The other passengers might not have noticed. But the weight of the room had subtly rearranged itself, pressing just a little more heavily against their row. A few seats ahead, an older gentleman, distinguished in the way that only age and privilege can afford, caught Nathan's eye as he leaned across the aisle to whisper something to his wife. She responded with a soft nod, casting a glance in their direction. Polite but probing. Nathan didn't flinch. He was used to being observed. To them, Nathan knew, he and Evelyn were guests in a room no one had explicitly told them they could not enter. But one in which they were expected to remain quiet, unobtrusive, grateful. That, Nathan thought, was the trick. It was never the loud things that wore you down. It was the soft ones. The assumptions that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. The unspoken contract. "We will tolerate you, so long as you do not disturb the air we breathe." Halfway through the meal, Karen returned to refill drinks. Her smile had thawed slightly. No longer forced but cautious. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked the woman across the aisle, lingering as she poured another glass of champagne. When Karen turned to Nathan and Evelyn, her warmth cooled. "Would you like more water?" The difference was subtle, but Evelyn caught it. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. Nathan smiled and shook his head. "We're fine." Karen nodded, but her gaze lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Nathan didn't look away. She broke the gaze first, moving on as if nothing had passed between them. As Karen disappeared into the galley, Evelyn leaned closer to Nathan. "It's funny," she said quietly. "You can almost hear her asking herself how we got here." Nathan chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "They're not used to seeing us in places like this." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but that's not the problem. It's that they think they should have seen us coming." Nathan tilted his head slightly, taking in the room once more. The soft conversations, the polished shoes tapping lightly against the carpeted floor, the flight attendants circling the cabin like choreographed dancers. And the glances. Always the glances. Nathan set down his glass, the ice shifting gently inside. "It's a game," he said, more to himself than to Evelyn. "And they've been playing longer than we have." Evelyn's lips curved faintly, though her eyes remained cool. "That may be true," she said, folding her napkin carefully over her lap. "But they forget one thing." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Evelyn met his gaze, the soft light catching the gold of her bracelet as it rested against her wrist. "We didn't come here to play." Nathan smiled, leaning back into his seat. As the plane cruised further into the night, the soft hum of privilege that filled the cabin no longer felt as impenetrable. It felt fragile, and Nathan wondered how much weight it would take to break it. The plane sliced through the night, and the hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, a sound that, under normal circumstances, could lull a person into forgetting where they were. But Nathan Clark never forgot. He sat still, as if listening for something beneath the surface. His eyes fixed out the small oval window where the stars flickered faintly against the endless dark. Across the aisle, the older gentleman had long since put his book down, though it rested open on his lap. His gaze, soft but lingering, returned to Nathan every few minutes. Nathan could feel it, the weight of being seen. Evelyn shifted beside him, crossing her legs slowly, deliberately, as if to remind the room that she wasn't going anywhere. She didn't need to glance at Nathan for him to know she felt it too. Karen passed by again, moving briskly with the air of someone who wanted to appear busy. She avoided their row entirely, though Nathan noted the way her eyes flicked briefly to their empty glasses before she disappeared behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. Nathan exhaled through his nose. "That's the third time she's skipped us," Evelyn said, her voice soft but pointed. "Maybe she forgot." Evelyn smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Karen doesn't seem like the forgetful type." No, Nathan doubted that she was. It wasn't forgetfulness that had kept her away. It was a calculation, the same instinct that caused people to walk a little faster past certain neighborhoods at night. The same reflex that kept wallets held a little tighter in certain spaces. Except this wasn't the straight. It was first class. And Nathan knew that was the part Karen couldn't quite make sense of. A murmur drifted over from across the aisle. Nathan didn't catch the words, but he caught the tone. It was hushed, careful, but laced with the familiar flavor of speculation. He shifted slightly, enough to catch the old man's eye. The gentleman's gaze faltered, and he quickly returned to his book, though Nathan noticed his hands now rested stiffly over the open pages, as if to keep them from trembling. Evelyn, following Nathan's line of sight, leaned in closer. "Let them stare," she whispered. "It's good practice for when they find out who we are." Nathan chuckled under his breath. But the weight didn't lift. He had lived long enough to know that being seen wasn't the same as being recognized. One came from curiosity, the other, from acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, Nathan thought, was a far heavier thing. It was almost an hour into the flight before Karen returned. This time, she approached with the carefully rehearsed smile Nathan had come to expect. The kind of smile that wasn't about warmth but about covering the absence of it. "Can I get you something?" she asked. Her tone stretched thin by the effort. Nathan glanced at Evelyn, letting the pause linger just long enough for Karen to notice. "We're fine," Evelyn answered, though her voice left no room for misinterpretation. Karen hesitated, her eyes flicking to Nathan as if waiting for him to interject. He didn't. With a nod that felt more like a retreat, Karen moved on, her steps softer now, as if hoping the carpet might swallow the sound of her departure. But silence, Nathan knew, was rarely a retreat. It was an invitation. The woman across the aisle, the gentleman's wife, took it first. "It must be exhausting," she said suddenly, her voice loud enough to reach them but not the rows ahead. Nathan turned his head, meeting her gaze without speaking. She hesitated, but only briefly. "Traveling," she clarified, though the meaning hung plainly between them. Evelyn straightened slightly, her eyes sharpening just enough for Nathan to feel the shift beside him. "It's not," Evelyn replied with a soft smile. "But it does get interesting sometimes." The woman offered a polite laugh. The kind people give when they know they've stepped too close to a boundary but aren't sure how to retreat. Nathan watched the exchange unfold the way one watches a pot begin to simmer, knowing that if the heat remained, it would eventually boil over. Her husband shifted again, clearing his throat as if to reset the room. Nathan could almost hear the thought behind his carefully neutral expression. "Let's not make this uncomfortable." But comfort, Nathan knew, had never been the point. As the flight carried on, the tension grew quieter, but it did not dissipate. Nathan wasn't surprised. He had long understood that the weight of prejudice rarely announces itself in grand gestures. It seeps in through small moments. The hesitant glance, the forced smile, The glass of champagne that arrives for everyone else but never for you. The tricky part, Nathan thought, was that no one ever felt responsible for it. Karen would convince herself she had simply been distracted. The couple across the aisle would chalk their curiosity up to innocent observation. And by the time the wheels touched the ground, everyone would return to their lives convinced they had done nothing wrong. But Nathan knew better. So did Evelyn. Because the weight of small things adds up. And eventually, someone, somewhere, would have to carry it. The cabin was dark now, save for the soft glow of reading lamps scattered unevenly across first class. The plane hummed steadily through the clouds. But inside, Nathan Clark could feel the stillness sharpening. He had lived long enough to recognize that there are two kinds of silence. The first was the kind people sought. Soft, comforting, the absence of conflict. The second was the silence that filled the spaces where words should have been spoken but weren't. This was the second kind. Across the aisle, the older gentleman's reading light flickered as he thumbed through the same page he'd been holding for nearly half an hour. His wife had long since fallen asleep, her head tilted toward the window. Karen had stopped coming around entirely. Nathan watched as another flight attendant, a younger man with a softer face, moved quietly through the aisle, offering refills and blankets to the other passengers. But he never stopped at their row. Nathan's glass of water sat empty on the tray beside him. The ice long since melted. Evelyn's glass mirrored his. Neither of them had said a word. That, Nathan thought, was how it worked. No one says you can't have champagne. They just don't bring it. No one says you don't belong. They just let you wait long enough to feel it. Evelyn shifted slightly, resting her chin on her hand as she gazed out the window, her breath leaving soft clouds on the glass. Nathan leaned toward her. You see it, don't you? He whispered. Evelyn didn't turn. I saw it when we boarded, she replied. Nathan chuckled softly. You always see it first. She smiled faintly but said nothing. It wasn't that Nathan was blind to these things. He had learned to recognize them early. The slight delay in service. The hesitance that trailed behind their presence. But Evelyn, she had a way of feeling the air shift before anyone else. It was a skill born from years of navigating spaces that I didn't expect. And still, here they were. The quiet stretched until it pressed against Nathan's ribs. He could feel it, the slow unraveling of patience. Somewhere near the front of the cabin, Karen's voice floated back in hushed conversation with another passenger. Nathan couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the tone. It was easy, light, effortless. That was the thing about prejudice. Nathan thought. It was never heavy for the person carrying it. It was heavy for the person standing on the other side. Evelyn straightened in her seat, smoothing the crease in her slacks with careful precision. She's not coming back, she said, her voice calm but certain. Nathan nodded. He already knew. I suppose we could ask, he suggested lightly. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes sharp. And what would that change? Nathan didn't answer. They both knew the answer. The second flight attendant, the young man, eventually drifted toward them, his steps hesitant as if he'd suddenly realized their glasses were the only empty ones in the cabin. Can I get you anything, sir? He asked, though the apology was already in his eyes. Nathan looked at him for a long moment, measuring the weight behind the offer. He could ask for the champagne. He could point out the empty glasses and the way Karen's hand had skipped over their row, as if service had somehow stopped short of reaching them. But he didn't. Instead, Nathan smiled softly. No, thank you, he replied. The young man nodded and disappeared as quietly as he had come. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You're letting it slide. Nathan exhaled, leaning back in his seat. There's no point in chasing ghosts. Evelyn considered that for a moment, then shook her head. I'm not sure they're ghosts, she said. They're right here, sitting next to us, watching. Nathan glanced across the aisle, catching the older man's gaze again. This time, the man didn't look away. Later, as the plane descended through the thinning clouds, Nathan felt the tension in the room shift again. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to avoidance. The quiet hope that once they landed, the weight of this moment could be left behind, folded neatly with the napkins and tucked away like it had never existed. But Nathan knew better. As they taxied to the gate, Karen reappeared at the front of the cabin, offering parting smiles to the passengers disembarking before them. Her eyes flicked to Nathan and Evelyn, and for a brief second, she hesitated, her mask slipping just long enough for Nathan to see the question sitting behind it. Did they notice? Nathan held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between them. He never answered, because he didn't have to. Some things, Nathan thought, are not meant to be explained. They are meant to be felt. The plane had landed, but the journey was far from over. Nathan Clark remained seated, watching as the other first-class passengers gathered their belongings and filed out in orderly rows. There was something rhythmic about the way they moved, like they were rehearsing a ritual passed down from generations of comfort. Karen stood by the exit, her smile crisp and uniform, as if the last few hours had been nothing more than routine. Evelyn stayed beside Nathan, her hands resting calmly on her lap. But her eyes, tracked every movement. She wasn't watching Karen, she was watching the ones who didn't look. The ones who pretended not to feel the air thickening as they passed. Because that was the thing about moments like this. It wasn't about who looked at you. It was about who worked harder not to. The older gentleman across the aisle glanced at Nathan one last time. His brow furrowed as if he wanted to speak. But he didn't. His wife placed a gentle hand on his elbow, guiding him forward as though she feared what might happen if he lingered too long. Nathan watched them disappear through the narrow door at the front of the plane. "You see it, don't you?" Evelyn whispered. Nathan nodded. "I always do." Evelyn exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight she had been carrying since the moment they boarded. "It's funny," she said softly. "They never have to say a word. But somehow you hear it loud enough anyway." Nathan smiled faintly. Silence is its own language. Evelyn's lips tightened. "And I've been fluent for years." The cabin had nearly emptied when Karen approached their row. "Mr. and Mrs. Clark," she said, her voice carefully measured, as if balancing on a wire. "I hope you had a comfortable flight." Nathan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Karen's posture was polite, professional, but there was an urgency behind her eyes. A silent plea for confirmation that whatever had unfolded over the last few hours could remain unspoken. Nathan had seen that look before. It wasn't a regret. It was fear. Fear of confrontation. Fear that whatever fragile walls separated discomfort from acknowledgement might come crashing down. Nathan rose slowly, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead bin. "We're used to waiting," he said lightly, fastening the buttons on his jacket. The flight was fine. Evelyn stood beside him, her gaze steady on Karen. "But next time," Evelyn added, tilting her head, "you might want to check the glasses." Karen blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Excuse me?" Evelyn smiled softly. "For the champagne," she replied. "I think you missed ours." Karen opened her mouth as if to explain. But nothing came. Instead, she stepped aside, letting them pass. Nathan felt Evelyn's hand slip through his arm as they made their way toward the exit. Behind them, the quiet followed. As they entered the terminal, the bustle of the airport swirled around them, voices echoing off polished tile, the rhythmic tapping of heels against the floor. But Nathan couldn't shake the lingering weight of the cabin. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Moments like this rarely ended when the seatbelt light flickered off. They lingered, stretching out into the world beyond, folding themselves neatly into conversations and doorways, into the quiet spaces where prejudice rarely raised its voice but whispered just loud enough to be heard. "Do you think she knows?" Evelyn asked as they approached the baggage claim. Nathan didn't need to ask who she meant. "She knows," he said simply, "but that's not the point." Evelyn nodded, her gaze drifting over the faces around them. "The point is whether she'll care enough to remember." Nathan's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his briefcase. "She'll remember." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I suppose that's something." Nathan glanced at her, his voice soft but certain. "It's always something." The doors of the terminal slid open, and the cold evening air pressed against them as they stepped outside. Nathan tilted his head toward the sky, the stars barely visible against the glow of the city lights. The world, it seemed, had a way of moving forward, regardless of who carried its weight. And as the night stretched on, Nathan Clark walked forward, knowing that some doors were meant to stay closed. But others had been waiting to open all along. The terminal's bright lights stretched endlessly overhead. But Nathan Clark felt the shadow of the flight still clinging to him. It followed quietly, the way memories of old battles sometimes did. Not as sharp as the day they happened, but persistent enough to linger beneath the skin. Evelyn walked beside him, her heels striking the polished floor in steady, deliberate rhythms. They didn't speak as they moved through the terminal. There was no need. The air between them was thick with the unspoken. It was the same heaviness Nathan had felt as a boy, when his father led him through stores where clerks watched but never welcomed. The same quiet weight that had accompanied him into boardrooms, where handshakes felt just a little colder than they should. Evelyn felt it too. He could tell by the way her eyes skimmed over the passing faces, as if measuring the distance between them and the world that had learned to watch without seeing. At baggage claim, the carousel spun idly, a metallic hum filling the space. A man in a dark suit stood several feet away, tapping his phone, his gaze flicking to Nathan and Evelyn with casual curiosity. Nathan had seen men like him before. The ones who didn't stare outright but watched just long enough to wonder. What do they do? How did they get here? It was a script Nathan had memorized. As the carousel creaked to life, Karen appeared across the room, talking to another flight attendant near the gate. Her voice was low, but her glance in their direction betrayed her. Nathan didn't turn away. Neither did Evelyn. "She'll talk about us," Evelyn said softly, not as a question but as certainty. Nathan exhaled. "They always do." Evelyn nodded, wrapping her coat around her shoulders. The movement fluid and controlled. "Good," she whispered. Nathan smiled faintly. The carousel lurched, and one by one, the passengers gathered their bags, filtering out into the night, their presence fading as easily as their footsteps. But Nathan and Evelyn remained. They were the last two left when a second flight attendant, a young man with careful hands and nervous eyes, approached them. "Mr. Clark?" he asked cautiously, as if unsure of what words should follow. Nathan turned to him, offering a polite nod. "I just wanted to say, I hope your flight was pleasant," the young man said, though his voice trembled slightly under the weight of the moment. Nathan studied him for a beat longer than necessary, letting the pause stretch just enough for the attendant to shift uncomfortably. "It was fine," Nathan said at last. The young man exhaled, relieved. But as he turned to leave, Evelyn spoke. "Why didn't she serve us?" The attendant froze, his back stiffening as if he had been caught in a place he hadn't intended to stay. "Ma'am?" Evelyn stepped forward, her tone polite but unwavering. "Karen," she clarified, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "She skipped us. More than once. You were there." The young man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the gate as if hoping Karen might reappear and save him from the question. But she didn't. Instead, he swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way." Evelyn smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Supposed to," she repeated softly, the words lingering between them. The young man lowered his gaze. Nathan stepped in, his voice calm but heavy with intent. "You know," he began, "it's easy to forget that people remember the small things." The attendant glanced up, meeting Nathan's eyes with uncertainty. "But we do," Nathan continued. "We remember the drinks that don't come, the tickets that are checked twice, and the bags that are searched when they shouldn't be." The young man said nothing. Evelyn stepped closer. "You seem like someone who doesn't want to forget," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't," the attendant replied quietly. Nathan held his gaze for another moment, then nodded. "Then don't," he said simply. As the young man turned to leave, Evelyn caught his sleeve lightly. "Tell Karen we said thank you," she added, "for the lesson." The attendant blinked, unsure whether to smile or apologize again. In the end, he did neither. Instead, he walked away, disappearing down the corridor, leaving Nathan and Evelyn standing alone by the now empty carousel. Outside, the night stretched wide and indifferent. Nathan felt the cold air settle around him as they stepped onto the curb. "You didn't have to say anything," Nathan murmured as Evelyn slipped her arm through his. Evelyn smiled. leaning into him slightly. I know, she replied. But I wanted to. Nathan glanced at her, studying the faint curve of her lips. The way her eyes reflected the streetlights overhead. It's not about Karen, is it? He asked. Evelyn shook her head. No, she said softly. It's about everyone who's watching. Nathan exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her words settle in. Because that, he knew, was the truth. The lesson was never just for Karen. It was for the man in the dark suit, the older couple by the aisle, the flight attendant who couldn't quite meet their eyes. It was for all the people who believed that silence wasn't a choice but a shield. Nathan held Evelyn's hand a little tighter as the car pulled up to the curb. And as they drove into the night, he wondered how many more doors would quietly open, simply because someone had been brave enough to knock. Nathan Clark wasn't the type to raise his voice. Years of moving through rooms where his presence alone was questioned had taught him that silence was often the sharper blade. It was cut cleaner, left fewer scars on the hands of the one wielding it. But there was a difference between silence and invisibility. And as he and Evelyn crossed the hotel lobby later that evening, Nathan could feel the eyes again. Watching, wondering, placing them in quiet categories without ever needing to ask. The concierge at the front desk straightened as they approached, offering the kind of polite nod reserved for guests whose names he hadn't bothered to remember. Good evening, the man said, his voice as polished as the marble floors beneath him. Nathan offered a small smile. Good evening, we have a reservation. The man's eyes flickered, but not toward the computer screen. Instead, they hesitated, just briefly, on the tailored coat draped over Nathan's arm. The weight of Evelyn's diamond earrings. The subtle but unmistakable cues of belonging that didn't fit the assumptions stitched quietly into the fabric of places like this. Nathan had seen that hesitation before. It didn't matter that his name was likely already flagged for priority service, or that his company had been responsible for financing part of the very hotel they stood in. What mattered was that he didn't look like the usual guests who stood at that counter. Name, sir? The concierge asked, already glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone else to appear and correct the misunderstanding. Clark, Nathan replied. Nathan and Evelyn Clark. The pause that followed wasn't long. But it didn't need to be. The man's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, eyes narrowing as the screen revealed what Nathan already knew it would. Oh, the concierge said, straightening with renewed enthusiasm. Mr. Clark, I see you're in the executive suite. I apologize for the delay. Allow me to have your bags brought up right away. Nathan smiled faintly. No trouble at all. Evelyn didn't say a word as the man handed over the keys. But the moment they stepped into the elevator, the faint creak of tension between them grew louder. You saw it, Nathan said, watching her in the reflection of the mirrored walls. I always see it, Evelyn replied, her voice even. Nathan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. It's not even subtle anymore. Evelyn glanced at him, her gaze steady. Was it ever? The suite was immaculate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, soft lamplight spilling across the plush furnishings. The kind of luxury designed to make people forget the world beyond those walls. But Nathan had never been good at forgetting. He poured himself a glass of water from the carafe by the bar, standing near the window as the city stretched beneath him. Evelyn set her coat gently over the arm of the sofa, removing her earrings with the kind of care that suggested she was lost in thought. Finally, she broke the silence. They never expect us, she said, her voice distant. Nathan sipped his water, eyes fixed on the streets below. No, they don't. And when they do, Evelyn trailed off, her gaze meeting his in the reflection of the glass. They wait for us to prove why we deserve to be here. Nathan set his glass down carefully. That's the part they'll never say out loud, he murmured. Evelyn crossed the room, leaning lightly against the window beside him. I wonder, she said softly, how many of them realize that we see it, that we feel it, every single time. Nathan exhaled slowly, watching the headlights of distant cars weave through the streets. They realize, he replied. They just hope we're polite enough not to mention it. Evelyn's reflection offered him a faint, knowing smile. Polite, she repeated. We've been polite for a long time. Nathan turned, his eyes meeting hers. Maybe that's the problem. Later, as the night settled over the city, Nathan lay awake staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling the same familiar paths. He thought of the concierge, of Karen, of the glances that felt more like questions no one dared ask directly. He thought of the weight Evelyn carried beside him, not as something separate from his own, but as an extension of it. And beneath it all, he felt the slow, inevitable rise of something else. Not anger, not bitterness, but resolve, because Nathan Clark knew the truth. Rooms like the one they had just left didn't need to announce their intentions. The echoes were loud enough on their own. And sooner or later, someone would have to speak loud enough to break them. Morning came slowly, slipping through the sheer curtains of the hotel suite in soft bands of gold. Nathan Clark sat by the window. The city sprawled beneath him like a restless giant stirring from sleep. Evelyn's soft breathing filled the space behind him, steady and calm. But Nathan was not calm. He had woken early, long before the sun made its way above the skyline. Sleep had felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Because even here, wrapped in the quiet elegance of a place few could reach, Nathan could feel it, the weight that remained. It clung to the edges of yesterday. Karen's lingering glances, the older couple in first class, the concierge, who could barely disguise his surprise. Nathan sipped his coffee, though its warmth did little to chase away the cool hum of thought settling beneath his skin. He remembered his father's voice, low and steady, like the sound of rain against the roof. They don't need to say it, son. You'll know it when you walk into the room. You'll feel it before a single word is spoken. And Nathan had felt it. His whole life had been shaped by that knowledge. The spaces that tightened when he entered. The narrowed eyes that asked questions his success could not answer. How did you get here? That question followed him. It clung to Evelyn too, draping over her shoulders the way the silk of her evening gown had the night before. Nathan watched her sleep, and beneath the love he felt for her, something else stirred, something heavier. It wasn't fear, it was exhaustion. Because Nathan knew the truth no one wanted to say aloud. There are some rooms where you are never allowed to simply exist. You carry history with you, whether you want to or not. Evelyn stirred as the sunlight grew brighter, stretching lazily before her eyes fluttered open. She found Nathan near the window, her gaze softening as she watched him. Couldn't sleep? She asked, her voice rough from the morning stillness. Nathan shook his head, smiling faintly. Didn't feel like sleeping. Evelyn rose, wrapping herself in the silk robe that lay folded at the edge of the bed. She crossed the room quietly, lowering herself into the seat beside him. For a while, they simply watched the city. Then Evelyn broke the silence. You're still thinking about yesterday. Nathan didn't look at her. He didn't need to. You're not, he replied. Evelyn's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Of course I am, she said. But what else is new? Nathan exhaled, shaking his head softly. That's the part one can't stop thinking about. He admitted, the fact that none of it was new. Evelyn's hand found his, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm in slow, familiar motions. I know, she whispered, but we didn't make those rules. Nathan. Nathan turned to her, his eyes dark and thoughtful. No, he said quietly. But we keep paying the price for them. By the time they left the suite and stepped into the lobby, the world had settled back into its usual rhythm. The concierge from the night before was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a younger man who greeted them with the same polished courtesy that felt more like performance than sincerity. Nathan nodded politely but said nothing. As they crossed the marble floor, Evelyn paused near the entrance, adjusting the strap of her handbag. Nathan noticed the man from first class. The one who had watched them carefully. The one whose silence had felt heavier than his words ever could. He was standing by the window, newspaper in hand, though his eyes weren't scanning the pages. He was watching them again. Nathan met his gaze and held it. The man hesitated, caught somewhere between guilt and curiosity. Finally, he lowered the paper. You know, the man began, his voice softer than Nathan expected. I wanted to apologize. Nathan waited, letting the words linger unfinished. I should have said something, the man admitted. Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. But Nathan's expression remained even. You didn't. Nathan replied calmly. The man shifted awkwardly, glancing down at his shoes. Nathan watched him for a long moment before sighing. His voice low and deliberate. People like me, we've learned not to wait for apologies. If we did, we'd spend our whole lives standing still. The man's face flushed. He looked ready to retreat. But Nathan wasn't finished. I'm not angry, Nathan continued. I'm just tired. The man nodded slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line. I suppose that makes sense, he said. Nathan glanced at Evelyn, her eyes soft but unwavering. Don't suppose, Evelyn said quietly. Just understand. The man looked at her, then back at Nathan, nodding once before stepping aside. Nathan led Evelyn toward the door, holding it open as the city's morning air swept over them. As they stepped outside, Evelyn looped her arm through his, glancing up with a wry smile. You were polite, she said. Nathan chuckled softly. Politeness is cheaper than frustration, he replied. But it costs more than it should. Evelyn tightened her hold on his arm, leaning into him as they walked down the street. You know, she said thoughtfully, every time we leave a room, we leave something behind. Nathan nodded. And sometimes, he replied, that's enough to make sure the next person isn't standing there alone. The weight hadn't lifted. But maybe, just maybe, it had shifted.